Welcome, folks. We're just going to wait until about 9:02 to allow people to come in, and then we'll get started. All right. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. My name is Braden Kay. I'm with the Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Program at the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation, joined by my colleague Angelo, and the rest of our team, Colin, Kelly, Catherine, and Riley are all on as well. And just really appreciate everyone being here to hear about really great extreme heat work that's been happening over the last several years at the city of Austin. So I'm going to do a brief description of our round of funding that just was released last week, and then we'll get into a conversation about the city of Austin. So one of the things that we've done both in our first round of the grant program and in this round is making sure that we're developing this community of practice around how communities work on extreme heat, and we bring in national examples to help inspire you as you think about how you could use funding from our grant program to either start or continue work in your own communities. Next slide. So we'll do a quick overview of the grant program, and then we will get into the City of Austin conversation, and then I'll let you know at the end about some opportunities to stay engaged with the program and learn more about our grant guidelines and how you can apply to the program. Next slide. So this second round of funding is $27.5 million. The money's coming from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is California's cap and trade program, as well as the Prop 4 climate bond that California voters passed in November of 2024. And both of these types of money are really for funding for infrastructure for extreme heat. So if you applied or were interested in our first round, it was general fund money, and you really could do any type of project with it. These two types of money really want to be infrastructure. We've been trying to put flexibility into that so that there is a certain amount of money you can spend on social infrastructure, but these are physical grants for physical infrastructure, and there has to be a physical infrastructure component. Next slide. So we have four values that are guiding this round of the grant program. And the questions that we ask applicants are based around these four values. And as you've heard examples from other cities, these values are continuing to come up in the work that we're hearing about that's happening across the country. So they include harm reduction. So how are you reducing harm in your community to extreme heat, specifically harm that is affecting the most vulnerable populations in your community, whether that be people experiencing homelessness, people with housing or energy insecurity, young families, pregnant people, people over 65, a lot of outdoor workers or indoor workers. There's a wide variety of Californians that are particularly susceptible to extreme heat, and your program needs to be talking about how it is reducing harm with at least one of those specific populations. Then there's partnerships, this idea that effective solutions require both community knowledge and implementation capacity. And so we ask that CBOs partner with local governments and local governments partner with CBOs, or academic institutions partner with both. So partnerships are a key value. Then we have the value of belonging. That means that you're doing work to ensure that the infrastructure is designed with and for the people that use it. So we will have some specific trainings on what our expectations around belonging are. It's a value we didn't have articulated in the first round in the same way, and so we're really excited about it. But know that some communities need to be in conversation with us about how they can do that as part of their projects. And then lastly, lasting community benefits. It's the idea that you're thinking beyond the grant term, and that whatever you're building, you're thinking about how that's inspiring or providing a pathway for future investment in resilience to extreme heat infrastructure. So really, it's us wanting to make sure that our dollars are not just contributing to a single solution, but are growing the capacity for additional solutions in your community. Next slide. So there's two project types because there's two types of money. So the greenhouse gas reduction funds are funding early infrastructure projects. That needs to result in a planning document for heat infrastructure. It can be a planning document for all types of heat infrastructure, or it can be a specific type of heat infrastructure, like a microgrid master plan, or a cool pavement master plan, or a cool corridor master plan, or an urban forestry master plan. But it does have to have an infrastructure demonstration component. So in this case, the example we give is a cool corridor master plan with a shade structure demonstration project. On the advanced side, this is a big infrastructure project that you've probably already been planning for. So you have to make sure you're convincing us that you can build this thing within the 48 months of the grant period. But we're also asking you to do that sort of lasting benefits work. We're calling it a future implementation playbook, which is some type of project documentation that's speaking towards how future work is going to get done. And then the example of a project like this is an actual cool corridor construction project. And then you do an implementation playbook for how you would build cool corridors throughout your city or your jurisdiction. Next slide. So types of things that you can be working on, you've heard me give some examples so far, but built environment solutions you can work on: cool pavements, shading, passive and mechanical cooling, building upgrades, hydration stations, transit shelters, and then also nature-based solutions. So urban forestry, green spaces, green stormwater infrastructure. And then we also really like to see projects that are combining both built environment solutions and nature-based solutions. Next slide. So in terms of some more details about each of the grant types, early infrastructure, 30-month projects, $750,000 to $1.2 million. Somewhere between 25 and 40%, 60% of the project budget needs to be for demonstration projects. And then there's a minimum budget that has to be spent on your partnership work, and a minimum amount of budget that has to be spent on your belonging work. The way we've designed early infrastructure is so that you can have mostly a planning project that has a 25% of your budget doing demonstration, or you can do mostly a demonstration project that has some amount of money for planning. So we were hearing from communities across California that they wanted that kind of flexibility. Some really need to do more planning, some needed to be doing more demonstrating. So we just decided that we could build that flexibility into this grant type. Advanced infrastructure, this is $3 to $4.5 million investment. 70% of your project budget has to be spent on the infrastructure. And then there's a 6% minimum for your partnerships and a 2% minimum for your belonging investment. Next slide. So there are priority points that are given to having to do with the Prop 4 climate bond. There's requirements in that bond language saying that 40% of that money has to go to disadvantaged communities and vulnerable populations, and at least 10% has to benefit severely disadvantaged communities. So we will have a point process. We will have sessions where staff from our climate services department walks you through how to figure out how many points you're able to get for your project area. And so we'll be talking about that more. Next slide. So in terms of who can apply and what the partnership requirements are, you have local and regional public entities, so governments, school districts, different public entities. If you're a public entity, you have to have a CBO or tribal partner. If you're a community-based organization, you have to have a local or regional public entity or tribe on the partnership. If you're you can be a coalition. You can be a public higher academic institution, in which case you need both a CBO and a local public entity, or you can be a California Native American tribe or tribal entity, and you're not required to have a co-applicant for that work. Next slide. So in terms of the application process, we currently have window 1 open. So if you know your project needs one-on-one TA support, we have a firm contracted with us called Civics that does one-on-one TA support. If you want one-on TA support to help you with your application, to help brainstorm the design, to help make sure you have all the critical components, you have to do the pre-application, which is basically the beginning of the application, by July 21st. We will then give you feedback. We'll let you know if we're able to provide technical assistance, and you'll get the full link to the application. If you do not need one-on-one technical support, we still will have general technical support. You can come to office hours. You can come to learning sessions that we just can't provide one-on-one technical support. You can then give us your idea by August 11th and do your pre-application by then. We will give you feedback and then allow you to go forward with your full application. Next slide. So in terms of the timeline, the final application is due October 13th, and then we hope to award in early 2027. Next slide. So now I really want to be able to get to the city of Austin. Mark has been doing incredible work there on climate resilience and adaptation and is a common speaker on the heat circuit and has really led some great innovations. And unlike some of the other cities where we brought them in to talk about a specific project, we really wanted Mark to talk about the wide variety of work they're doing and sort of the journey that the city has been on how they address extreme heat. And so that's what Mark will do. Then we will have a question and answer period at the end about this project. If you have questions about the grant program, then we're going to be asking you to come to our events either on the 25th or on the 30th, or email us directly with any questions about the grant program you have specifically. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mark.
Thank you, Braden. So to go to the next slide, should I just say next slide or? Okay, so let's stop here. Let's go back one. Yeah, so like Braden said, I've been working here at the City of Austin. I've been here for 16 years looking at how climate change impacts our assets and operations, but also our community members, which is why rather than start with heat, I want to start with cold. Because in Austin, we are in the South. People do sort of assume we're going to get hot. It is crazy hot now versus what it was in the past. But for us, we are not prepared for the cold at all. I moved to Austin from upstate New York, so 6 inches of snow wasn't really uncommon. But in Austin, it is devastating. And this is a picture of downtown Austin in February 2021 for Winter Storm Uri. And it's hard to explain how bad it was. We don't have plows, we don't have salt trucks. Half the city lost power, a quarter of the city lost water. People really didn't know how to deal with cold, so they're bringing like their grills inside their homes to heat up. So it was really, really not a good situation for us. Next slide. And what it really elevated was that the people with the least amount of resources were people who are often the worst hit and the first hit. They're the ones who, lost their food, lost their ability to, lost power, lost water, and just didn't know how to prepare. So there were long lines at HEB, which is our local grocery store, and then people were sort of confused. People lost their lives. And also, this is 2021, so this is during COVID. So another reason why people really didn't know what to do. Next slide. So the City of Austin Council passed a resolution creating a resilience hubs program. They didn't know what resilience hubs were. They sounded really cool. They thought it could solve a lot of these problems. And at the end, we end up having a hard time just defining it. So council passed a resolution. asking us to like identify locations, look into passive survivability, like if the building were to lose power or water, like how does it actually function? Look at vulnerable population, making sure that people can get there through a 15-minute walk shed. I don't know if for those who haven't been to Austin, it's a very suburbanized city, so 15 minutes doesn't get you too far. But then lastly, what are those 6 hubs we want to start right now just to try it out and test it out? So we received this at the Office of Sustainability. Now we're called the Office of Climate Action and Resilience. And our first reaction was, where do we even start? Like, how do we even get this started? Next slide. So what we did is we got together, we said, hey, let's really focus on these 3 buckets. Like, what are the facilities on the bottom right left? When people are talking about resilience hubs, they were often talking about like backup power and physical infrastructure. And we realized that was definitely part of it. But in the middle, we also knew that it was about hub activation. Like, what do these things actually do during an event? How do we ensure that people are safe? How do people know where to go? And the bottom right is like, how do you make sure the community has a voice in creating that so that when an event does happen, they automatically know to go there and they can automatically sort of know what to expect. This all rolled up into a leadership team, which was like the executive folks. But the most important part on the top right is the community advisory committee. Next slide. This was a group of about 40 groups ranging from community activists, community organizers, but also like the Red Cross, hospitals, universities, all coming together to sort of drive the effort, give us feedback, essentially have them co-create it with us so that we knew that when we were making decisions, it was backed by lived experience and it was really thinking about what are unintended consequences or cascading impacts. And this was really the best part of the whole thing was really bringing that community together. Next slide. So knowing that we had to do 6 pilots, we had a series of workshops where we worked with the community to talk about like what were past events, what were past reactions, how did that impact the community, what data should we be looking at? So they had, us look at income, raise, language, undocumented, but also where is the hottest, where are the most floods, where are the most sort of climate impacts. And we came up with these 6 areas of focus. And in Austin, we call this the Eastern Crescent, the area of Austin that has community members with the least amount of resources and or have lived experience that make it difficult for them to bounce back from big events. And one thing to really touch on too is that most of the flooding in Austin happens from the top left to the bottom right. Most of the flood waters come into the city. So flooding happens in number 6. A lot of the extreme heat events happen in the 1, 2, and 3. And then number 4 on the right, it's sort of a mixture of heat, but also a lot of grass fires. So that's where we see the most amount of people with asthma and COPD. That gives you a breath of like, this is where we started. The next step is we actually went into all of those 6 communities, next slide, and had conversations with community members about where they would go naturally. So what are those trusted places in the community? And for the community members we talked to, trusted locations were like their homes, their parents' homes, like where would you go? I go to my grandparents' house. Places of worship like Catholic churches, mosques, other locations, synagogues, etc., were identified as places they would go to. A lot of people were really connected to their schools. Either they went to the school there or their kids go to school there, so they felt a piece there. And then rec centers and libraries were definitely part of that conversation. When we switched the conversation to where would you go to if you had to leave your home, number 1 was I would go to my friend's house, my parents' house, my, grandparents' house. Places of worship were definitely on that list. Schools were off the list. This is right after Uvalde, so we couldn't just have people walk into a school and they knew that. So we quickly took that off. And then rec centers and libraries became more important because that's where we do a lot of after schools sessions at rec centers. We do a lot of programming at libraries. So people are already familiar with those. So when we had this conversation, the community members were like, well, let's start with rec centers as a pilot. We hadn't talked to churches yet, and then schools were off the table. But the question then became like, what are these resilience hubs? And when we asked the question to the community members, it ranged from like, hey, these are brand new facilities with all the bells and whistles, as if it's like this UFO that'll come down and just plop down with all the solar panels and backup battery, etc. It ranged from that to, hey, this is a parking lot where we'll actually do food and water distribution. And that's a lot of difference. People were asking it to be be able to go there at 2 o'clock in the morning for snacks, all the way to like, hey, I just want to know where to get a computer to do internet. Another interesting piece, though, is that we actually went to those locations and asked the rec center and library staff, like, what do they need? And oftentimes these rec centers were used as overnight shelters for cold weather or for flooding. And what the folks at the rec centers really wanted was one is Spanish classes, de-escalation classes, and then some ability to have a crew come in and clean up and help out if it was used for of an overnight shelter. When we asked the community members what they really wanted at these rec centers and resilience hubs, it was English classes, computer classes, Zumba classes. So it was a really sort of a different perspective on what they wanted and what they needed. But at the end of the day, we were never really able to define resilience hub because our rec centers were great for sometimes sheltering, but their parking lots were not good for water and food distribution. Yet the school 2 blocks over had a huge parking lot we could use for water and food distribution. Meanwhile, the libraries couldn't be used as overnight shelters, but they had a lot of sort of information that could be used for cooling centers and warming centers. So the inability to have one location do everything really got us to really think, why are we doing this? Are we using the right term? So next slide. So here's our big challenges. Like when people were talking about resilience hubs as emergency hubs, but that's for the shock. And we really were also focusing on the stressor. Like they really wanted this to be a community hub as well. So how do you sort of balance the emerging need and the day-to-day needs? At the same time, council was asking us like, hey, when do we get our resilience hubs in our districts? And we're like, well, we're really focused on who needs it the most. And that was also sort of a balance. Like, how do we put them everywhere, but only really on places that need them the most? The last thing is community members were so impacted by these events that they were worried that the next event was going to be next week. So how do we get this up and ready as soon as possible? Meanwhile, we're trying to figure out like how do we get money and then classes and resources in the community so that they can prepare themselves, which takes a lot longer time. So how do you balance urgency with like being able to have community members sort of be on their own 2 feet and do this work? So it was really, really challenging. Next slide. What we ended up landing on was changing the name to the Austin Resilient Network because we realized it wasn't one location or one person. It was a series of organizations and locations and organizations working together. And then also, the city manager allocated 5 positions to Resilience Hubs Network, and those all went to Mercy Management. So when Mercy Management owned this, they really shifted the gear towards more of like monthly meetings with community members, more in collaboration, who does what, who needs what. While we were still in the background investing in these locations, this became the press forward. So this is what was the background of Resilience Hubs. I do want to switch gears now to our cooling and warming centers. Next slide. So warming and cooling centers, do we need them? Do folks even use them? And this is sort of this ongoing conversation. Do we need them? Yes. Do people use them? Not so much. So the reason I say that is because the people who use the cooling centers the most in Austin tend to be the unhoused. And those tend to be more in sort of the downtown area. In West Austin, when we activate cooling centers, people tend not to go to them because in West Austin, which is more affluent, there's definitely less of a need for it in those locations. And then warming centers, I mean, we say cooling and warming centers together because, while we do get hot here, we also get cold on occasion, and that's new to us. So we want to make sure we're talking about those things together. And then the other thing is that when people do show up to cooling centers, we don't ask them if they're there for cooling. At the library, people just walk in, they use the library, the bathroom. We just don't ask those questions. So we're not 100% sure if people are using them as formal cooling centers or just informal cooling centers. That said, we do need more of these. We need to have these available when needed. Next slide. So I assume all of you on this call have already done the mapping in your community of like where are those populations that are most vulnerable to either heat, to cooling, to drought, to wildfires, etc. And then also done heat mapping to identify where it is the hottest in your community. So we've definitely done this. You'll notice the Eastern Crescent again on the left-hand map, but then in the middle, you'll see that most of the heat is right in the center of town, which is basically on the I-35 corridor. Next slide. So based on this, we start to look at where are our cooling centers. Most of the cooling centers, the rec centers, the neighborhood centers in Austin were built in the 70s and 80s, so they're really built close to downtown. Yet we double in population every 20 years, so a lot of this population is get pushed to the east, to the right of the map. So we have this situation now of suburbanization of poverty mixing with rural poor in this area that is highly impacted by heat and then also grass fires. So using this map, we could see like, hey, where do we actually have locations? And then where do we not have locations? Next slide. So you'll see when you start to dig in, you have these pocket of areas without cooling centers. And if you look on the right-hand side, we started to map where are the faith-based locations. So these are, like I said, mosques, Catholic churches, Baptist churches, synagogues, etc. And starting to see like where can we actually work with those organizations to see if they can be their doors open for when people actually need them. A little bit of tension there because when we talk to, say, a Black Baptist church, they will tell us, yeah, we know when you give resources to the Catholic Latino church, we know it's for everybody, but it's really just for them. So trying to sort of break those barriers of like, how do we ensure that these churches are talking to each other and sharing resources across faiths? But this is still a work in progress. Also, like tying it back to like who actually needs them and how do we sort of tie it to the community in the area. Next slide. I'm not going to touch on this too much, just to know that we do have an emergency plan, a heat emergency plan. This is not public, which is a big issue, so people don't know that this exists. But it is something we're trying to actually make public. Next slide. And then to give you a sense, we activate cooling centers when we hit the heat advisory from the National Weather Service, and that for us is equal to either a temperature of 108 or a heat index of 108 or higher. And I know that's really high for some people. When I talk to our contemporaries in San Francisco, their heat wave started 80 degrees. There are plenty of days in August in Austin where we don't get below 80 degrees, even at nighttime. So this is phase one where we just say, hey, we're gonna, our cooling centers already exist. They're just basically our libraries and our rec centers. Their hours are generally open day, 8 to 5 or 8 to 6 for anybody to walk in and stay cool. Next slide. Now we do have sort of the next level, and that's when we hit a heat index of greater than 113 or temperatures of greater than 105. And that's when we really sort of extend hours, maybe start to bring water to these locations, and maybe start to like really start to look at heat surveillance, how many people are showing up to hospitals, how many people are getting picked up by ambulance, and try to sort of do a little bit more. But there's not really super sophisticated. It's not like we're not doing overnight cooling centers like they're doing in Phoenix. Next slide. So for us, our big thing for cooling centers is get more signage. When we talk to community members in the Eastern Crescent about cooling centers, they often ask like, what are cooling centers and how are they different? So maybe getting the word out better, setting up sort of pop-up cooling centers like misting tents like they do in Boston, distribute a lot more water and really look at extended hours. And then our emergency management department is looking at like what happens when you have a heat wave and a power outage. And that's a real emergency. So really looking at how we can get into that resilience hub work of backup power, which backup batteries, and then additional sort of cooling and heating at these locations. Next slide. But when we think about vulnerable populations, we think about the elderly, the young, the people who are medically vulnerable, but our biggest and most vulnerable population has to be those who are unhoused. And in Austin, this ranges from point of count of 5,000 up to like 15,000 people in Austin could be unhoused at any one point. And a lot of these folks are living in the hottest part, which is along freeways and in downtown area. Next slide. So when I showed you this picture earlier of the Eastern Crescent where the communities and these community activists told us where to focus, the huge blind spot was downtown because people experiencing homelessness don't show up on census data. So when we didn't even think about looking there at first, now we realize we made a huge mistake and we have to be thinking about those locations. So when we had a little bit of funding through C40, we started to work with this organization in downtown, Urban Alchemy, about, hey, who's impacted by heat? How are they impacted by heat? And we did a survey of people of like, hey, walk us through a typical day when it's really hot in your life. Next slide. So we surveyed about 151 people outdoors, in the streets, in parking lots, and asked them, "Hey, how are you impacted by heat?" And the people we interviewed actually aligned pretty well with the demographics that exist of people who are unhoused. In Austin, a large majority of people who are unhoused are men. 72% are men, while 27% are female, and then we do have trans and another gender. Um, but that really tracks with how many people are impacted by heat in Austin versus, say, Barcelona. 82% of people in Barcelona impacted by heat tend to be elderly women. So, and then the age part, mostly between 45 and 60. So, my age, and then some people at 65 and plus. But when it gets into they've been unhoused, the majority of people are between, say, one and in over 3 years. So, been out there for a while. And then race ethnicity, large portion is Black African American, followed by white, and then Hispanic. So we had one-on-one conversation with these people. Next slide. And while we assumed they were really looking for indoor heat, like cooling centers, there was very little sort of talk about, hey, I need more cooling centers. What they really wanted, above all, is water. And not just water, frozen bottles is what they wanted above all, and a place to go where they wouldn't be bothered. And so as we talked to these people, we were like, well, we have resources right here. The challenge, though, is that there's a lot of push from politicians, especially from the state, of not having people congregate outside, especially the unhoused. They don't want people unhoused hanging out outside where it doesn't look good. And, they want to make sure that they're sight unseen. So a lot of these locations provide services, but they only provide it for a couple hours, like 9 to 11, and then another place opens up. They open up from like 1 to 3. So this population is basically just being pushed around downtown, and they oftentimes just need a place to sit, some water, and to make sure they're safe. Then we asked a question of like, how did they actually find out about this stuff? 42% word of mouth. Word of mouth goes through the community so fast. It's incredible. Like if you put out a phone alert, you'll get some traction. But if you tell one person, hey, this is going to open up in an hour, you get a lot more people showing up. So next slide. Understanding that there aren't one location that extended hours throughout the day that provides services. We had a whole workshop with about 20 organizations just to say, like, what time do you open? Where do you located? And then where people go there and where do people walk around downtown? Because we realized we can't just do a pop-up cooling center everywhere, that we needed to do target relationships. We need to like get to the people where they are, making sure they're safe, getting them water, and then providing them resources to make sure that they know where to go. So this, next slide, gets into this latest slide, which I know is a little hard to read. Dark reddish orange is the hottest place. When you get closer to the water, it's cool. There's this area that has a lot of activity. It's also the hottest place in Austin. It's got downtown Austin. It's got a lot of parking lots. And then making sure that we're actually meeting them there. But then they walk throughout downtown throughout the day to go to libraries, and then ensuring that we touch base and communicate with them. One of the biggest lessons we learned from the Resilience Hub work and this work is that the site itself is important, but it's not the most important. You need people to go to these places, but it's that relationship between the sites. Like in the Resilience Hub work, we had community health workers. We started to train community members as climate ambassadors to make sure they know what to look for, to check in on their neighbors, to like make sure that people are safe, that when it's hot, that people are knocking on doors. And then this one too, we learned that, yeah, there's a lot of resources, a lot of locations, but they're not really consistent in terms of hours. So we needed these organizations to come together and have outreach teams to make sure they're going door to door and meeting with people. And then once you meet with them, having a clear pathway to helping them. So so these people are trained in de-escalation, but they're also trained in what resources to provide. So we're handing them a bottle of water, and then we're also giving them resources and a way to get out of the heat and out of the situation. So last slide. If there's any lesson, one is set expectations. You can't just say resilience hubs and people assume that it's going to solve all your problems. Understand like what the problem is in the community and how does your solution actually help it. Two is it's about network and relationships. If they know you, you want to be a familiar place and a familiar place. If they know you, they're more likely to trust you. We have a large population in Austin that are undocumented, definitely do not want to talk to me. How do we make sure that people are talking to them and that they're safe and that they know where to go in case of an emergency? And then really spend money on community ambassadors, community health workers, on a medical reserve corps that we're starting up. How do we ensure that that relationship is strong and that those people who are most at risk are really know what to do? And for us, that means more internal training for the city, like not just knowing what to do when it's hot, but when to recognize when somebody else is having an event. It also means like, hey, making sure our standards and our contracts are designed for people who work outside. A lot of our staff work outside and ensuring that they have protocols. And then in Texas, we can't enforce that on private entities, but like, how do we ensure that we sort of slip them the OSHA laws and that they know their rights when it gets too hot? And then, yeah, heat is really dangerous. Heat plus a power outage or heat plus another event is even catastrophic. So how do you start to think about unintended consequences and yeah, making sure everybody's safe? Thank you.
Mark, thank you so, so much. And I know we've heard, um, from quite a few of our communities across California around the need to support people experiencing homelessness. And so really you walking through how you develop that network um, and do some of that network building and do some of that sort of deeper understanding of how those communities actually operate and what they actually need is really helpful because I think there's a lot of communities that want to be doing that work, and so seeing how you've done that is so helpful. And yeah, I think for those folks that have been in the climate resilience space for a while now, there's just been a lot of tensions around like what are resilience hubs, what is community resilience, what are the best ways to really address it. And I think the way that you speak to those tensions and the way that you speak to maybe it doesn't make sense to force a single solution down towards the community. And one of the things that we've been really pushing is yes, you need a vulnerability assessment. You need to know who's the most vulnerable to heat. You need to know where it's hottest, but you also need to know your assets. You need to know what tools your community has, what trusted spaces, what resources a community has that they would be relying on in a cold event, in a heat event. And so that journey you've been on, I think, is a really important one because a lot of communities have been trying to figure out that tension. And as we know, you're speaking to the faith-based conversation was very important. It's like faith-based communities have an important role to play, but a lot of those spaces are not inclusive. And so like, how do you resource those communities to the degree it's appropriate, but how do you also understand the limitations that some of those spaces have? So just really important conversations that you all have been working with and going through. While we're waiting, if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to put a question in the Q&A prompt. I'll ask a few questions until I see any pop up from those of you that have been listening here. So, one thing that we have always understood in our grant program is that climate shocks should not be siloed. And sometimes there is this intersection of different climate shocks. And I'm wondering if you can speak to, some of the things that you may have learned from other shocks that then may be informing how you deal with extreme heat in the future. So I've really been impressed by the work that Austin's done on wildfires and building codes for wildfires, and potentially now thinking about how that building code work could translate into you thinking about building code for extreme heat. I'm not sure, and, obviously you learned a lot from the cold snap that is from the cold crisis of 2021 that you're now learning for extreme heat. Do you have other examples of sort of shocks that you've gone through that make you think about how you could take some of the things that you have worked on in one area and how those might apply to extreme heat?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things. We try to sort of connect, like not talk about one thing without it benefiting another, like you're saying. We are looking at fresh air centers also, with, knowing that in East Austin, these cooling centers are really good for people who need them, but also knowing that we have such a high rate of asthma and COPD in East Austin. How do we also look at like MERV 13 filters and sort of make sure we have spaces that are, better for people who are experiencing sort of asthma attacks? And then for wildfire, yeah, I mean, there's definitely an overlay between sort of green building standards and wildfire. Like external services, how do you design your landscape? We definitely sort of connected that. We are lucky enough to have our own energy company. We have a municipal energy company called Austin Energy. So they already have a green building program since the early 90s, which was the precursor for LEED. And they've started to look at like what are those relationships between like double pane window for heat and double pane windows for wildfire. I do want to sort of tout one benefit is that in 2023 it was so hot that council passed a maximum indoor temperature for housing, both for rentals. So if you are a property owner of multifamily, you have to keep the indoor temperatures 9 degrees cooler than the outdoors at max 85 in every single habitable room, except for bathrooms and closets. And if not, people can call code and then our code will show up. And then if the landlord doesn't provide cooling to those spaces, then they will get fined. And then if it gets over a certain temperature, you only have to provide cooling to one room. Now, provide cooling just means you could just do a window unit, but it allows us to sort of enforce cooling for people who really need it. And then, yeah, we've sort of shifted away from looking at purely the building code for cooling because we've already done a lot around insulation and around cool roofs. We're shifting more and more to sort of urban design. Like, how do we know we have a lot of projects coming up. How do we start to map heat adjacent to these projects so that we can start to think about planting trees and make sure people are cool going to and from these locations? And that's becoming a new opportunity for us just in the past couple of months.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Um, Mark, can you talk a little bit more about nature-based solutions and thoughts about expanding riparian habitats and some of the green infrastructure conversations? I've had the opportunity to tour some of Austin with you to see some of these investments, but yeah, Jen was really curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a very strong environmentalist community dating back to the 1960s and 70s. Um, so that has been part of our thinking for some time now. And we've done, we have a 41% tree canopy right now for the whole city. With the goal of 50 by 50, so it's 50% tree canopy by 2050. That said, it has not equally distributed. West Austin has as high as 81% tree canopy, while the Eastern Crescent, some places have as low as 17% tree canopy. So we are doing a lot more work around trying to get trees planted in sort of Eastern Crescent in general. Then on the sort of the bioswales and rain gardens in the right of way, the city of Austin has a watershed protection department, which is about 400 or 500 people, just looking at like water quality and floodplains. A little bit around localized flooding, so this is flooding outside the floodplain. been a lot of work on like how do you actually use the natural system for flooding rather than big culverts, and we've done a good job of removing culverts. That said, there's still sort of a little bit of disconnect between like putting bioswales and rain gardens in all the right of way and thinking that's going to cure flooding because we get flash floods in Central Texas, which are super dangerous. And think like 4 feet to 6 feet of water coming through the community in a matters of minutes. So green infrastructure is really good. We still have a challenge of green infrastructure at the regional scale to really sort of slow down the big storms. And I think that's our next step. Uh, and then lastly, you talk to these watershed folks, they would much prefer to put a concrete box with sand in the right of way. It is so much easier to stop flooding and to manage right of way versus, say, a rain garden where if you let it grow with natural plants, people complain they think they looks like weeds, and that becomes sort of a political hot potato. So there's still a little bit of tension, which is within our engineers and our planners within our watershed department around that.
I know recently that Austin established a Native American and Tribal Commission. What has been the role of Indigenous voices in the community resilience work, and have those conversations been maturing at all? It's one of the questions we have in the Q&A.
Yeah, that one's a hard question to answer. So we double in population every 20 years. So think about 1920s, we had about 30,000 people, and most of the population in Austin is brand new. So we have a growing population of displaced people from other countries, like refugees. We have a very, very large population of Hispanic Latinx folks in Austin, which is fantastic. But we're also seeing a lot more people from like Sudan and Vietnam and other locations, which is great because we have a lot more vitality. The indigenous people, non-tribal or tribal, that sadly doesn't have as strong of a presence in the voices in our work. And I think it's a challenge for us in general. Um, yeah.
That's helpful. We will have a session from some Indigenous artists that have been doing city-based work in Arizona. Mark is a product of Arizona State University, so he knows that Arizona has a lot of examples of how governments work with tribes, around how tribes lead their own climate resilience efforts. And so we will highlight some of those. But yeah, it's clear when I've talked to a lot of colleagues across the West, a lot of the climate resilience work has not been in conversation with tribes and with non-tribal indigenous leaders as in the way that it could be. So we will have examples of that in the work that we do in this grant program. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the Chicano community and sort of how the work that you've done has been sort of celebrating and linking to the richness of the Mexican community, Mexican American community, Chicano communities in Austin?
Yeah, I mean, um, I don't know if you haven't been to Austin, I would definitely recommend you come here. And then, I mean, our food, our buildings, our whole landscape is really sort of heavily influenced by the great sort of population and diversity we have within Austin. Um, and then actually, rather than tell you, I'll give you an example, is that we were recently at a rec center in Eastern Crescent, and I was looking out and I was realized how hot it was is because it was a building in the middle of a field, and the field looked like it was designed for England, a lot of grass, a couple of trees, and I'm like, this is not really designed for Texas or the community. So we're going through a process now with the help of University of Texas, starting in the fall, to actually have a design charrette for our rec centers and a guideline to say, how do we design rec centers for the cultural community adjacent to those locations, design it for heat, but also design it so that you can maintain it with a reasonable amount of funding. And I think just those three questions would have a huge impact on how we design these projects going forward. We bring in those voices as much as we can. We first bring in the community activists to the conversation, and those tend to be really connected to the community in Eastern Crescent. We have not had a great relationship in the past 50 years. We did some not great stuff back in the 70s and 80s, and I think we're trying to amend those that history now.
And then you talked about this some with the initial mapping that you did, but can you talk a little bit more about the role of data when you're making decisions around climate risk and a heat risk, and what are the conversations you have to have with your city council around the costs of these investments versus the benefits? And, obviously with some of these um, climate investments, like if a climate resilience investment is successful, the way you know it's successful is you don't notice it. Like
Right.
there isn't that heat death on the street, or there isn't, you know, um, you know, people suffering heat illnesses. Like, so how do you have those kind of cost benefit conversations, and what is the role of data in decision making in that
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. If I do my job, nothing happens, right? And I think that's the challenge of trying to make the return on investment on resilience and adaptation. Um, yeah, I mean, the first thing is I don't go to council and ask for money because that's a hard challenge because it's impossible to say one tree will save one life or like make that relationship. So what we've done is actually sort of reverse the conversation. We know where it's hot. We don't need maps to tell us that. But once you get in those communities, it's hard to know like, do we plant a tree there or do we plant a tree there? And the map doesn't really show you what's happening in the community. So what we did is we had a lot of conversations about like how does your day change based on heat? And like where do you go and like actually have people pin on a map like where they mostly go. And we thought it'd be like school and a rec center. It turns out it was like random parking lots at Walmart, and it was like these places we never really looked at is because that's where laborers were getting picked up for work or getting dropped off for work. And we realized if we can somehow connect those lived experience to actually implementation, it would actually make a huge difference. So after a lot of these conversations, all of a sudden we had $70,000 from JP Morgan Chase to be like, hey, do a cool corridor. And my first reaction was like, okay, great, we have money. Let's do a workshop with the community members. And the community members were like, no, just stop talking. Just stop. We've already told you where we want things. Here are all the places we want bus shelters. Here are the places we want trees. And here are the places we want drinking fountains. And then we had that list. We had the money. We just were able to sort of act on it within a couple of weeks. I mean, act on it, able to sort of get things started in a couple of weeks rather than have to go back to the community. We had already built those relationships. We already knew where it was hot from the data. We already knew where the people wanted the stuff from the data. Sort of being able to connect that quickly was key. So having those relationships and being able to be like, hey, I got money, turning that around quickly, I think is really the sweet spot.
Um, I also wanted you've done some really good work historically with public health departments. And I think that there's quite a few counties on this call and quite a few counties or cities that want to be working more with their county public health departments, and, folks that know that public health needs to be a critical part of this work. Do you want to speak a little bit to like what you've done in that public health kind of space, and some sort of advice you have about how to make sure public health is at the table for extreme heat work?
Yeah, I mean, without public health, we'd be doing none of this stuff. None of this work would happen. Because, for example, the folks working on adaptation resilience for the city of Austin is like 1.5 people, maybe 2 people full. That's me and one other person. I need public health to sort of be showing up, providing feedback, providing cooling kits, doing training. So they're definitely a core piece of any work I do around heat because they understand the impacts, they understand the physical aspects of it, but they also can talk to the community members. They are very passionate, very talented. Also, public health is like my emergency management whisperer. Like I can say stuff to emergency management and they look at me with a blank face. I can say it to public health, they say it in a different language to emergency management, and they're like, oh, I get it. So they are a really great translator, not just for our office emergency management, but also our office and like the community themselves, because they have community ambassadors, they now have a medical reserve corps. A lot of the folks in public health speak Spanish. I mean, they they know it. They already have the talent, the ability. They just don't have funding. And I think because half their funding comes from federal government, and that's always waffling, I think they get underpaid, but they're also super talented and energetic. So figure out how to get them money and then figure out how to have them sort of do the work they do to help you out.
Yeah, and they can also be hugely important on that data side of making sure your region has better public health data and help drive some of that conversation.
100%. I mean, they do heat surveillance, and we use that all the time to try to get council to be thinking about these things.
Um, what, yeah, just on that quickly, and then I have one final question. What are some of the strategies that you've used to get more political support for heat work? And like, what does that look like? I think there's a lot of folks that are going to need to use our funding to convince their county supervisors or their city council members or their tribal council members that heat is worth investing in. What have you learned?
Yeah, I mean, I guess first thing is we are a council city manager form of government. So we don't, as staff, talk to council on a regular basis, but the community can. So the more we work with the community and we have a joint understanding of the heat impacts, the more that conversation can happen with politicians. And politicians, they talk to their communities all the time. The second thing is that like making it clear how dangerous heat is. I mean, in Austin and in nationally, more people die of heat than any other extreme weather combined. So ensuring that they're thinking about it and they're communicating that back, and then tying data to decision, or it's what we say, no stories without data, no data without stories. When the community members talk to council, they're like, it's hot. They're like, well, that's dangerous, but it's hot, and here's how the numbers that really show the impact. That has a huge impact on council members in general. And then lastly, they see our staff working outside. They know it's super hot. They're starting to make that connection between resources and heat and understanding how dangerous it is. So we're seeing a little bit more political views on heat, which is great. Just need another heat wave to make it happen. So don't let a disaster go to waste.
And then lastly, you brought up earlier, because this is where my head has gone over the last, when I was doing this work locally in the city of Tempe, I really started pushing on regional solutions because
Mm.
there was so much of the green infrastructure work that needed to happen regionally. Quite a bit of the energy security and energy resilience work went beyond city borders. What's your thing? Like, if you could wave a magic wand and have two or three things happen regionally that could really help protect people in the Austin region, what would they be? I'm hoping that some of our grantees are ambitious enough to do some local things, but like it's aspire to do regional things. And I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, we're starting to do a lot more regional work between here and San Antonio and all the counties in between. And one of the biggest thing I could want to do if I could wage a magic wand is get corporations involved because they tend to be at arm's length to us because they're like, oh, you're just regulations and you're just trying to get money from us. But they have staff, they have buildings, they're also experiencing the heat. How do you get them involved so that we're sort of working together on the same solutions? But also they do have resources. So how do we leverage that? We're working a lot more with Google on like how do you start to map heat and then potentially look at scenarios of like wildfire plus flooding using their new Google Earth, shifting from EIE to Google Earth. So how do you leverage corporations for funding, for co-creation of existing elements, and then innovation too? Like they're on the cutting edge. How do we leverage their uh, staff to help us going forward?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that, um, thinking bigger about partnerships and thinking about all of the different resources the community has. If you're going to have good economic development in Austin, and then this is true for a lot of places in California, heat is going to impact those bottom lines. So if you're going to develop an
Yeah.
economic development vision for 30 to 50 years for hot places, like it means corporations needing to be part of heat solutions. It means needing an economic development message that also incorporates investing in keeping your communities cool. So I really like where your head's at there.
I will put one more thing because I know we're out of time. Is that if you imagine Austin, most of our activities are outside. They're on picnic benches, eating breakfast tacos, drinking beer, whatever. But if you imagine a world where it's 110 degrees outside, most of our economic driver is gone. Like there's nobody sitting outside. So then who are we if it's 110?
What a profound way to end today's session. Mark, we cannot thank you enough for sharing your vast experience in the work that you've done in Austin. And thanks for being a partner in this work. And thanks for your time and honesty and openness of sharing today. Thanks everyone for coming. We'll see you. We have our webinars on the 25th and the 30th. We had the link up for you to make sure you register for those. You can also register for our newsletter. And we really appreciate your time today. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.